Beneath the pale, dying sun of the world called Eldheim, the breath of empire hung heavy in the air, ancient, proud, and treacherously fragile. In the heartlands, lush with golden rye, and broken by the bones of forgotten kings, peasants whispered old charms as they tilled blackening earth. Towering above their villages were the granite cities of the splendid Dominion, their banked fires and radiant stained glass, symbols of an order thought invincible. Yet far beyond these walls, something grim and restless had awakened. For as long as memory stretched, the four great houses ruled Eldheim. Their banners fluttered from cloud-grazing castles, voices dictating laws, tribute, and the teachings of a faith older than stone. But even their reach ended at the jagged edge of the darkwood and ancient, forbidden forest where myths whispered that the world itself was thin and wild magic slumbered beneath every root. Traders returned with tailies of lightning in the soil, spectral lights flitting over the hills, and travelers gone mad from the howling of wolves that walked upright. No one living expected change. The peasants endured, the lords schemed, and magic real, wild, and forbidden was little more than bedtime terror for the foolish or desperate. Yet beneath the soil, in fetid burrows and rotting hollows, something unnamed was spreading, a rot that ignored boundaries, treaties, and ancient taboos alike. It began quietly, as darkness always does. On a windless autumn night, farmhands in the border village of Renholt discovered their cattle screaming in terror, throats clotted with a strange black foam. Next, the chickens rotted alive in their coops. By dawn, the old healer found pustules on her own hands, and the air itself tingled with an invisible, shivering hunger. The world carried on, as it always had, refusing to see what lingered on the periphery. Messengers still arrived, battered by weeks in the rutted King's Road, bearing new decrees and collecting the tax. In the cities, processions wound past the great cathedrals, incense billowing, while the court enchanters played at wonders for the amusement of jaded nobles. And yet, for those who listened, the wind in the trees no longer sang as before. Children grew silent, dreaming of shadows with too many eyes. Shepherds vanished on the high pastures. Rumors arrived like autumn mists, subtle at first, then pregnant with dread. A sickness had come from the dark wood, nameless, merciless. Those afflicted wept black tears, and their voices echoed with the whispers of unseen things. Older folk muttered that the veil, the ancient barrier that held back true magic, was failing. For centuries, petty spells had flickered in hearts, mere tricks compared to the wild majesty that had once shaped mountains. But now, as the plague spread, these lost magics shuddered back into the world with every toll of the bell for the dead. Within weeks, the pestilence stormed through the lowlands. Temples, once crowded with worshippers, lay heavy with incense and fear. Street healers hawked bottled hope and charms of salt and iron, while corpse-bearers filled the moonlit roads with the stink of grief. Everywhere the pulse of power old and hungry stirred in places that had long been banned. And amid this chaos, as the empire's banners darkened with rain and the numberless poor broke under the weight of loss, a new truth slipped quietly into being. The world would never again be as it was. For in the ruins of power, both mundane and mystical. The old order was crumbling, and magic, genuine, untamed, and hungry, was waking with a vengeance. This is the story of how the Black Plague of Eldheim toppled the mighty, unshackled enchantments, once thought vanished, and forged a new age not in gilded archives but in ash, blood, and the memory of all who would endure. In the waning days of autumn, the people of Eldheim sensed a shift that no one dared name. Even before the sickness, the great dominion was uneasy, a world trembling on the edge of secrets too old to remember. In Renholt, that ragged village huddled against the reach of mist and tangled wood, the change began without fanfare. The sun's warmth grew feeble and sullen, casting new shadows in familiar corners. The markets felt thinner, as if the crops and honey itself remembered what the elders tried to forget. It was a night of shivering wind and low, bruised clouds that the first strange death arrived. Lena Weaver, child of winter's lean, had been tending her family's fires for a decade, but now sat in the corner, her eyes wide and unseeing as her breath thickened and darkened. The village midwife, hands trembling, tried every poultice, every salt charm, every word she half remembered from her own grandmother, but the blackness crept unstoppably from Lena's nose and lips. By dawn, her skin had gone pale as wax, and her mother's weeping was only one sound among many. In the days that followed, it became clear that death was not content with one household. Donkeys brayed in confusion as farmers collapsed in fields of half-cut rye, their tools abandoned. The river, once a place of laughter, filled instead with bodies carried by cold current. Black roses appeared in the hedgerows flowers no one recalled planting, petals dusted with an oily shine that drank the starlight. Wordless fear settled on the village as livestock sickened and the crops withered at their roots. The elders convened in the candle-lit church, arguing in harsh whispers. Was it a curse, the price of some hidden sin, or merely a new form of the old fevers that visited every generation? Some remembered stories from their own childhoods, old tales traded at winter fires, the dark wood's wrath, the consequence of seeking magic in places where it did not wish to be found. But the plague paid no heed to their prayers. It struck without pattern young and old, rich and poor, faithful and doubter alike. Gravediggers became as familiar as priests. Piper Gurn, who made songs for every birth and every storm, was lost within a week, and the village's laughter vanished with him. The merchants that braved the road to the capital began to bring more rumors than wares. In the city, healers collapsed at their posts. Noblemen's children died before their first winter, and in the shadowed slums, whispers claimed that wraiths walked at night. Some blamed the Rotwind as the carrier. Others claimed the rivers ran backwards beneath a new moon. Yet a growing number told stories of people changed, not just sick, but different. In the burned farmhouse on the edge of town, a boy's body glimmered with blue light, his hair standing on end as if charged by a storm. Old Marish, who had never spoken a word since her childhood, was found reciting words that made the air shiver and copper rust. Those who witnessed these changes grew silent, reluctant to name what they feared. Magic, long outlawed, was riding on the wings of the plague. Beyond Renholt, in the fortified manors and cathedral halls of the Dominion, word of the sickness stirred both panic and denial. Some nobles dismissed the Tailies as peasant hysteria. Others barricaded themselves in their towers, sending armed men to block village roads. It made no difference. The darkness was not confined by stone walls, nor turned back by order or coin. As days shortened and the wind turned biting, travelers from the east arrived on borrowed horses, gasping of entire towns silenced overnight, of a black vapor pressing in from every side. Night after night, the villagers of Renholt listened to the howls rising from the dark wood. They feared the disease, yes, but more than that. They feared what the dying world was waking, and wondered, heart-pounding, what shape their lives would take as the first empire began to falter under the weight of the unknown. In this way the shadow crossed the border, not just between kingdoms and provinces, but into the marrow of the land itself. And as it spread, it carried more than sickness. It bore the death of certainty and the slow, inescapable return of powers that had been shunned since the world was young. As winter sharpened its claws across Eldheim, the great Dominion stewards clung to the illusion of command. In their high-walled citadels, where tapestries depicted the legends of brighter times, the lords gathered in council grim-faced, robed in furs, their breath clouding in the frigid hall. Every man and woman of consequence was there, from crown-appointed magistrates to the veiled hierophants of the old faith, all seeking a solution their ancestors had failed to preserve. The Chancellor of Glass, a figure known for his inflexible mind and voice like shifting gravel, pounded the council table. "We have contained greater threats," he declared. "Put down rebellions, chased demon cults to extinction. This, too, will yield to discipline." His words rang hollow to all who had seen the city beyond the palace walls. The market squares emptied at midday, tainted by the smoke of uncounted funerals. Guards prowled alleyways, searching for enemy agents, yet unable to recognize the true adversary coursing through their ranks. In the grandeur of the capital, the rot-wind plague in towns already stripped of names struck without mercy. The sick filled the hospice mansions and temple yards. Bells tolled in ceaseless misery. Yet for every death, a ripple of inexplicable occurrences followed. In the debtor's quarter, a girl touched by fever awoke from her last gasp, and in a fit of delirium, called forth a rain of fireflies that burned blue before bursting into harmless smoke. A scribe in the library, once mocked for mumbling to shadows, vanished in a spiral of wind and cold, leaving behind walls etched with arcane sigils. Rumors spread far faster than the infection. Whispers claimed that in Briarholm, a provincial town ruled by a lord whose ancestors had once hunted hedge witches, the dead rose in the night eyes gleaming, not with hunger, but with terrible understanding. In the port city of Cerro Red, warehouse keepers swore they saw cats transform into men and men into shrieking night birds, carried off by the same mists that haunted every fevered dream. The order that had weathered centuries began to fray. Merchants refused to accept imperial coin, bartering salt or honey instead. Soldiers assigned to protect the roads deserted their posts, preferring the uncertain safety of home to the certainty of exposure. Bands of wanderers filled the forests and hills, some searching for sanctuary, others preying on the weak. Old rivalries between border provinces flared anew as food supplies dwindled and the cold set in. And in every corner of the Dominion, the servants of the banned arts felt the stifling grip of the pact begin to loosen. For 200 years, the wielding of magic had been punishable by exile or death, a law as old as the last war with the North. Now, with lawgivers overwhelmed by the simple matter of burying the dead, strange talents crept back into the world with the stealth of creeping frost. The churches mourned but could not comfort. Priests of the seven auras, wrapped in their gold and indigo robes, met each dawn with prayers against pestilence. Yet many fell sick before the second chime of the bell. Amid the incense and ritual, simple folk brought their own offerings, bones of ancestors, seeds sprinkled on the threshold, moths captured in folded cloth, anything that might bribe or appease the unseen forces gathering all around. Even the Hierophants confessed their texts held no wisdom for this, no right to mend what had come undone. But most unnerving to the Dominion's rulers were reports from the outlands, the lands once closest to the source of the plague. Messengers, wide-eyed and starving, told of lightning storms bursting from clear skies, wild beasts speaking in human tongues, and children who walk through fire without harm. There were desperate tales of entire villages vanished in a single night, and of travelers sheltering in ruined keeps who found cryptic glyphs burning faintly along the walls, warning of greater dangers yet to come. Within the council's marble hall, the sense of command faltered at last. The chancellor's voice wavered as each relay brought darker numbers. In the looking glasses of the castle's upper tower, the court astrologer divined shifts in the star winds and trembled. What he saw had no precedent in centuries of recorded augury. The plague of Eltame was not merely a disease, it was an unbinding, an old oath broken. The empire's stonework groaned with it, every edict and custom peeling away under the weight of relentless loss. New rules ancient and wild crept into the cracks of the law, and with despair came a sudden perilous hope. That magic, long shackled by imperial will, was being unleashed at last. As the winter wind keened through shattered windows, and the last embers of old certainties flickered in the Dominion's heart, those who survived understood a grave truth. What threatened them now was not just death, but a future they could not imagine, a future shaped by magic reborn and a world brought low by plague. In the forsaken hours before dawn, when frost bit deepest and hope was a thin, ragged sheet over the sleeping, new stories began circling through Eldhane's stories of those forever changed by the plague's touch. They were not always told in words. Often they ran beneath the surface of fearful glances, the soundless hush that fell in the presence of a child who moved strangely, or a neighbor who now seemed to know the names of winds and ghosts. In Renholt, young Mylan's son of Vex returned from the brink of death with veins that shimmered faintly in moonlight, his every breath birthing coils of silver vapor. When he walked barefoot through the frost, the ground beneath his feet sprouted blue grass for a moment, even in deepest winter. His mother, torn between wonder and dread, forbade him from venturing beyond the ruined fence, though already the local priest was urging the elders to send him away, lest the hex and the rot entwine. Across the lowland farmsteads, the sick who survived awoke to impossible senses, hearing the flock's anxious thoughts, or seeing the fading auras of the dying from far off across barren moors. Rumors grew bold. Nara the pot girl held her palms over festering wounds and drew out the poison with a song none could remember teaching her. In hidden glens a shepherd threw back his head each noon to sing melodies so beautiful that flocks and wild stags lay quietly at his feet, spellbound and still. These gifts, which some saw as miracles and others as curses, set their bearers apart. Old divisions deepened. In lands ruled for centuries by suspicion and hierarchy, the emergence of magic among common folk was as shattering as the plague itself. Some villagers, desperate for meaning, called such ones the marked heralds of prophecy, chosen by unknowable forces. Others, their eyes wide with animal panic, hunted and expelled the gifted, driving them into the haunted wilds where the bones of lost empires lay hidden beneath thistle and vine. Fear and awe traveled together. It was whispered that when the moon was high, the children who spoke to fire or summoned shadows met deep in the old stone quarries. There, under constellations never mapped by any scholar, they shared dreams and pieced together half-remembered visions of a world before the Dominion, when magic was not hunted but cultivated like grain. Some dreamed of colossal beasts slumbering under the mountains, waiting for song or blood to wake them. Others dreamed they would one day find the source of the plague and command it, or end it at will. Outside Renholt, a different fate awaited such miracles. In the city of Holdfast, where the famine hit hardest, gangs of orphaned children roamed shuttered markets. Their leader a waif with only a single pupil-less eye, an eye that saw truths old queens had gone mad trying to glimpse. She led her charges through dangers armed with nothing but riddles and blue smoke, their survival witness to a power now growing in secret places. The old world was past saving. In every shattered household and every ruined temple, the survivors drew a line between what was lost and what remained. A mother learned to cherish the madness in her son, for it kept the shadow at bay. A priest weighed mercy and fear, uncertain which carried the heavier price. Communities fractured, then reckoned around new magics and new terrors, learning to barter not just food and labor, but secrets and miracles, strength and mystery. The plague was not finished with them, not by far. Yet in the twilight that followed, as the wind carried whispers of storm and strange fire across the fields, a new kind of people were taking shape, children of ash and storm, marked by plague and nurtured by the wild return of magic. Their fate, still unwritten, would decide whether the empire's fall would lead to ruin or to something unimaginably new. And as the old ones huddled in crumbling hearth-lit rooms, already the youngest survivors were learning a language of power lost for centuries, a language the world would soon be forced, one way or another, to remember. Through the hollowed markets and once peaceful glades of Eldim, the old hierarchies faded as quickly as warmth from abandoned hearths. With every passing week, as the Black Plague hollowed village after village, a vacuum grew not only of bodies, but of certainties, rules, and the invisible networks that had held civilization together for generations. Into that void, new orders formed, born of necessity, fear, and the raw possibility pulsing from the return of untamable magic. These new assemblies had no grand banners or chiseled manifestos. Their birth was the gathering of survivors, a smith and his fire-blooded daughter in the ruins of Toril, a hedge witch once hunted, now swearing the protection of every orphan under her care. Scattered bands of knights drawn not by loyalty to crown, but by omens bleeding through their haunted dreams. Old rivals found themselves pressed side by side, transformed by shared hunger and loss into kin willing, at last, to listen to those for centuries regarded as outlaws, heretics, or fools. One such congregation gathered at the edge of the Ashen Marshes. Its leader, once a vicar in the Dominion's church, had watched half her flock perish before confessing her own buried sorcery. Cloaking herself in the trappings of faith and spell work alike, she offered both prayer and a sharp-edged hope. Survivors marked by the plague, changed by what they had seen and suffered, flocked to her. Together they wove talismans of bone and melted coin, fusing old superstitions with newfound magics, their numbers swelling as stories of their protection spread. Elsewhere, a scholar-turned-wanderer named Garland the Seeker unearthed forbidden scrolls from the long-crumbled library of Hadron. He read aloud under shattered domes as peasants and petty lords alike listened, first mistrustfully, then hungrily to tales of the time before, when the lines between magic and flesh had not yet been drawn. By night, Garland was joined by a constellation of the marked. They meditated under the bleeding moon, blending half-forgotten rituals with discoveries born of suffering. New spells, shielded by charms of birch and salt. Communal dreams that stitched the pain of many into a single luminous tapestry. The plague had not only broken the Dominion's will, but also its monopoly on meaning. In the canyons between city districts, gangs of feral children brokered alliances with spirits that flickered in doorways, gods once scorned as rural fables now heard and answered. Along the borderlands, ancient stones awakened, Menhir and Cairn, thrumming in time with the fevered hearts of those desperate for purpose. Rituals, once private or persecuted, blossomed in the open air beneath branches adorned with tattered prayers and smudges of blue chalk. The more the plague withdrew from a village, the greater the hunger for belonging and explanation. Some turned to new faiths, others to old blood oaths. Some to science and the rediscovered natural magics that shimmered behind common things. Yeast, snow, toadstool, a newborn child's cry. The world, no longer overseen by a single code or king, became an untamed mosaic of micro-societies, each experimenting with its own forms of order, worship, justice, and power. Yet with wild orders rose wild dangers. Competition for resources brought bitter skirmishes where once there had been only politics. Not all wielders of new magic were merciful. In the shadow of fallen manors and choked rivers, predatory sorcerers carved out fiefdoms through fear and spectacle, summoning blighted beasts or raising illusions of plenty to lure in desperate souls. But for most, survival meant forging something between terror and hope. As spring edged uncertainly into the ruined fields and smoke cleared from the winter pyres, these patchwork alliances and fledgling cults offered a rope across the chasm of despair, a chance, however slim, that from the splintered world, something strong and wondrous might yet arise. In Eldhain, the old empires had been made by steel and silence, but the nascent wild orders were built of scars, shared secrets, and the flickering but relentless will to persist. All around, beneath the cold eye of the sickle-shaped moon, new societies breathed into life, holding their dreams and their terrors close, as a world remade by plague and magic waited for its future to unfold. News of the Dominion's decline traveled the battered roads and running rivers with a speed no edict had ever matched. By early summer, choristers in the once great cathedrals of the capital sang not hymns of triumph, but haunting laments for cities that reeked of smoke and sickness, for rulers who had vanished behind bolted gates, and for dreams of order evaporating beneath the heat of new uncertainties. The mighty walls that once protected the splendid Dominion now encircled little more than confusion and fear. The imperial banners, once brilliant with dyes from distant lands, faded to brown as the elements gnawed at forgotten stations. Courts where lawmakers and scribe mages had debated propriety and protocol became little more than echoing mausoleums where rats gathered and the dust of old parchment choked the air. Once thriving marketplaces, hives of trade and gossip, now lay silent but for the shuffle of refugee feet and the distant toll of yet another funeral bell. In one of the palace's highest towers, the Empress sat alone, her counselors lost to fever or fled in the night. A single window looked out on the sprawling city of spires and alleys, but the streets below seemed less real by the day, swathed in smoldering mist. She pressed trembling fingers to the old scepter, polished smooth where generations of sovereigns had drawn strength. Once the scepter was a focus for Dominion lore, all that remained of the age when peace was hammered into being by sword and treaty. Now it vibrated beneath her hand with energy she could neither command nor explain. Messages piled around her, none bearing solutions. Some demanded aid for dying outposts. Others were the desperate pleas of nobles hoping to regain favor through last acts of loyalty or betrayal. There were rumors of lords selling ancestral treasures for food, of catacombs bursting with the unburied, and, more chilling still, reports of magic users overrunning the provinces, sometimes healing, but more often wielding power unchecked as local rule collapsed. One dusk, as the first stars pierced the oily twilight, a masked delegation arrived. They were not of noble birth, but envoys of a new order from the south, calling themselves the Circle of Indigo. Their faces obscured by veils, their voices layered in spellcraft, they offered terms, sanctuary for all who surrendered their relics, and oaths on pain of exile for those who clung to the old ways. The Empress listened, silent and pale. Where once she might have summoned her secret guard or called for great engines of war, she now offered neither resistance nor acceptance, only a single weary nod. Outside her chamber, the palace grew emptier with each morning. The orphaned children of the kitchen staff wove garlands, not of laurel, but of bones, casting them with careful hands into the reflecting pools for luck. The last loyal ministers huddled in old map rooms, cross-referencing grain stores and praying for the mercy of whatever gods might still be listening. Night after night, small groups slipped through hidden passages, abandoning city and inheritance alike for uncertain fates, some seeking the wild orders, others hoping to vanish into the anonymity of distant ruins. Yet even as the Dominion crumbled, its collapse was not without convulsive beauty. The night sky over the city began to dance with wild lights, auroras of blue and emerald, pulses of power that rippled over rooftops and illuminated alleys where forgotten sorcerers, for the first time in centuries, practiced unbound magic in public. For some, the end of empire felt like a festival attended by ghosts, mad with grief but electrified by forbidden's hope. By midsummer, the splendid dominion existed only as legend, its artifacts scattered, its royal lines vanished or transformed, its ancient laws as hollow as the bells that rang unanswered. The survivors, peering from between shuttered planks or from tents on the city's outskirts, sensed the surpassing fragility of all things once thought eternal. Many wept for what was gone. Others, tasting new freedoms, sharpened the tools of their new trades, or whispered prayers to powers wilder and nearer than any emperor's decree. From the ruins of splendid dominion rose 1,000 seeds, some of chaos, some of invention, and above all, the dangerous intoxication that comes when the old order falls and the future is for the taking. Not through sword or counsel had the empire ended, but by the slow, inexorable unraveling sown by plague and the mad rebirth of magic. And as the wind swept lonely through its silent halls, the people who remained took their first honest breaths as free subjects of a world they now had the power and the burden to remake. Beyond the deserted splendor of the Dominion cities, the rural lands of Eldhame entered a strange, shifting limbo. Where once every field had been marked by rows of laborers, their songs drifting by the rhythm of reaping and sowing, now silence lay thick over the countryside. Wild grasses choked unharvested grain. Orchard trees stood heavy with untaken fruit, attracting clouds of ravens and unfamiliar glowing moths that the oldest still living swore were omens of great change. With so many perished, the survivors found themselves surrounded by an abundance of space and possibility, but also by the uncanny hush left in the plague's wake. Abandoned cottages became shelters for wandering bands, runaways, and the marked, those who carried the plague's magical legacy like a brand upon soul and skin. Former boundaries between master and servant, kin and stranger lost their old meaning, as need and new abilities forced new alliances. It was here, in these borderless lands, that the world's greatest transformations took root. Mara, once a serf beholden to a land barren, slain by the sickness, walked the empty paths with the courage of one who had buried her old life. Her hands, once crippled by years of toil, could now call forth subtle ripples in the fabric of air. She shared her meals and secrets with a bandit once feared in a dozen villages, now just a man seeking solace for wounds that refused to close a man whose night terrors sometimes brought lightning flaring in the trees. In the ashes of old law, new customs budded sideways out of hunger and hope. A village council would emerge among the stones of a forgotten town square, bound by a pact not of written word but of unanimous voice. No one's needs ignored for long, without warning dreams haunting the council's sleep. In another, a boy who could coax green shoots from frostbitten earth was made not a priest, but the heart of his community, offered gifts in return for lessons about the roots, the water, and the old language of weather that wailed in his throat each dawn. Trade, once the province of city guilds and taxed caravans, now traveled in circuits drawn by rumor and magic. One group of survivors might barter a sack of enchanted seed for stories of safe passage through haunted hills, or trade a week's labor in return for the blessing of a moon-touched elder whose voice calmed plague-borne fevers. Currency became talismanic iron nails, feathers from the new blue moths, bone tokens etched with sigils believed to attract mercy or luck. Yet danger stalked the fields as well. With the weakening of tradition, not all who claimed power did so for the good. Sorcerers corrupted by pain or driven mad by the rush of awakening magic prowled the roads, hunting for those whose gifts could be bent to nightmare purposes. Spectral animals, once figures of folk tale, now hunted livestock and travelers alike. Even the land itself seemed restless. Old stones sometimes moved overnight, and an entire valley, once lush with crops, grew eerily cold, its dew black as ink, refusing to thaw even under the summer sun. Between ruin and renewal, the people of Eldheim learned to trust what senses and dreams revealed, rather than what old priests or queens decreed. A new wisdom took root, born from suffering wild powers and the unrelenting need to survive together in the face of the unimaginable. Through the silence and the returning bird songs, a new world gathered breath. For those who endured, every field and ruined lane seemed draped in the possibility of magic, dread, and of freedom their ancestors could scarcely have dreamt. And as the moon waxed full above the empty watchtowers, it was whispered in every village that the greatest transformation of all was still to come, when the marked would gather, and the fate of Eldheim would finally turn from mourning to creation. As the long summer waned and a ragged harvest moon rose above shattered towers and wild gold meadows, an unspoken summons rippled through Eldheim. The marked those whose veins carried the living memory of plague and unleashed magic felt it as a restlessness in their bones, and the pull of fate whispered in half-remembered dreams. Somehow, wherever they hid or wandered or tried to build new lives, each understood when and where to travel, as if led by the voice of the very land that had suffered and changed beside them. They arrived singly and in ragged bands, converging without fanfare upon the ruins of Emberwyn, the lost city at the world's heart. Emberwyn had once blazed with 1,000 lanterns, its river a silver ribbon threading temples and foundries. Now, tangled ivy twisted through the marble arches, and the old river shone only with the ghostly lights that hovered wherever the marked stepped. Mara, her hands trembling with the charge of new magic, passed beneath the city's broken gate, followed by Mylan, whose silver breath coiled in the morning air. There was Nara, the song healer, the blue-eyed waif whose voice drew animals gentler, and Garland the seeker, weighed down by tomes salvaged from libraries turned to dust. Behind them trailed children, former courtiers, the odd bandit lord. Grandmothers once whispered to be witches, all changed, all emboldened and isolated by the power etched in their flesh and memory. They met in the shadow of the city's collapsed amphitheater, ringed by firefly auras and guarded by runes that burned only when marked feet strode near. No banners, crowns, nor shackles barred this council. Fear and exhaustion were common tongues. Yet beneath the uncertainty, a current of fierce curiosity throbbed. What if, joined, their gifts might not only heal but remake what the plague had ruined? Throughout the night, stories mingled with the rising mist. One spoke of an old herb woman in the southern hills who quieted fever with just a glance. Another of a child in the east who summoned rain enough to fill the old irrigation canals. There was grief, too, the price each had paid. Families vanished, homes claimed by opportunists or wild creatures, friends who grew unrecognizable beneath the weight of unmastered power. As voices rang and flames fluttered, garlands stood before the gathering. What the old world called curse is simply wild promise untended, he declared, holding aloft a twisted length of root that glimmered with hidden runes. We may never again be what we were, but we need not be what we fear. Let us learn from one another. Let us dare to shape what will come, not by the iron of vanished empires, but by the mingling of gifts, all gifts, light or shadow guided by our wounds and our hopes. A hush fell long enough for all to feel the breath of the world itself listening. Then slowly, with awkward bravery, the marks began to demonstrate what the plague had left them. Lights from fingertips, words coiling into clouds, hands that healed, eyes that saw through stone, voices that rose together into a weaving power as old as Eldaim itself. In that moonlit gathering, something unthinkable took root. Not just survival, but a vision of creation. New pacts were sworn not to kings, not to churches, but to each other and to the unbroken land. A people who had once lived in fear of their own natures now dared to imagine the weaving of a new world, forged from all they had lost, all they had suffered, and the wild unlocking magic flowing newly through every living thing. As dawn paled the ruins, the marked held council and agreed. Whatever terrible force had toppled empires and filled centuries with shadow, it had also opened a gate. The future would be written not by those who clung to the bones of dominion, but by those who endured, dreamed, and dared to remake Eldaim together in the slow unfurling light of a new age of magic. With the first light of dawn kindling the ruins of Emberwyn, the air trembled, not with fear or sorrow, but with anticipation. Across the shattered city, the Marked awoke to a dawn unlike any Eldhame had known in centuries. The plague was not truly gone. A shadow still haunted every empty street and silent hearth, but its grip had loosened, replaced by something equally daunting yet strangely luminous: possibility. In small circles, the Marked began to experiment, guided by the memory of what they had survived and the strengths now pulsing within. They forged a discipline neither wholly ancient nor raw and wild. Mara and Maimon worked side by side, testing the boundaries where Maimon's breath of silver vapor calmed wounds, and Mara's ripple of breeze coaxed dormant seed to leaf. Nara, the song healer, wove melodies into fabric, her voice stitching tears in old cloaks and in grieving hearts alike. Garland read aloud by afternoon sunlight pooling through gaping roofs, leading the Marked in study and memory. Some techniques were recovered from deep within half-burned tomes, practices for drawing energy from the world's hidden veins, invocations for harmonizing with spirits rather than bending them to will. Other lessons were born from crisis, intuition, and hard-won humility: how to keep one's gift tethered in sorrow, how to share power without burning out, how to grieve what was lost without poisoning what could still be made. Yet, even in hope, there lingered doubt. Not every Marked could fully master their abilities. Some, overcome by power or memory, still faltered, turning crops to glass, calling lightning in sleep. For them, the circle provided patience, learning that failure was part of this new world, neither exile nor execution, but careful guidance and the stories of others' mistakes. An ethic of care grew, quietly, a promise never written but fiercely remembered. Soon, the gathering spread from the amphitheater to the gardens, the river embankments, even the ancient library, where wild vines now pushed through cracked mosaics and marble. Together they began to heal what had been torn, burying the last dead in ceremonies that mingled old rites with new songs, clearing streets and planting enchanted seeds that sparked into blossom overnight, restoring a shattered fountain, its waters now rippling with visions of distant lands and long-lost kin. People from across Eldhame arrived tentatively at first, but drawn by stories of healing, protection, and peace. Some brought the sick, others brought broken relics, scrolls, or merely the burden of bad dreams seeking solace. All found the same reckoning. While the plague had decimated body and order, it demanded the birth of connections stronger than what had come before. Over weeks, Emberwyn glimmered anew, a beacon, not of empire or conquest, but of rebirth and shared strength. Magic was not used to dominate or divide, but to balance, harmonize, and slowly, patiently rebuild both the spirit and the stone of Eldhame. For the first time, marked and unmarked, ex-noble and orphan, monster and sage, all labored side by side, choosing a way forward not sanctioned by old law, but by the consent and hope of a scarred people. As twilight deepened and the first true stars winked awake, Garland gathered the council. No throne, no regalia, but a simple fire around which all sat equally. "Let this be our vow," he said quietly. "We are bound not in fear or old chains, but in the choosing of each other. Where darkness once ruled, let us create. Where magic divides, let us heal." Under the vast and altered sky, the survivors answered not with hymns of the Dominion, but with the sound of many voices weaving together a new kind of world. The birth of magic, once feared, now became the shared heartbeat of a future where every scar, every gift, and every loss shaped the dawn tender, radiant and utterly their own. As summer faded into a gentle, haunted autumn, the story of Emberwind's renewal sent echoes across the rambling tapestry of Eldham. What began as necessity slowly became tradition. In village after village, the marked returned not as exiles or omens of doom, but as envoys and partners in the reshaping of daily life. Wherever they went, signs of the old world's demise mingled with the green shoots of what might come next. The work of healing was neither smooth nor easy. Some towns welcomed the new order eagerly, hungry for what magic and unity could promise. Others, still clinging to fading banners or bitter memories, watched suspiciously as the marked restored rain to scorched fields, rebuilt bridges with a touch, or drew lost children from bramble-filled streets with a call. Yet the tide was patient. The transformation unhurried but steady, threading its way through even the hardest hearts. In the forests, ancient trees that had witnessed empires rise and fall now hummed with quiet, pulsing life. Bands of children marked and unmarked together learned to listen for the songs of stones, to read weather in a flight of moths, to share food and story around fires that gleamed with wandering lights. Old superstitions were reforged into understanding. Practices once hidden in shame became the shared inheritance of a people who had faced extinction and chosen not merely to survive, but to imagine anew. The dangerous ones, those who had twisted their gifts into weapons or used power to dominate in the chaos after the Dominion's fall, were not ignored. Emberwind's council fashioned pacts and watchful circles, insisting that magic serve the living world and the dignity of every soul. Mercy mingled with vigilance. Exile remained, but it was rare, reserved only for those who refused any road but the one of harm. For most, even the gravest errors were met with the offer of guidance, an open hand instead of a closed fist. As time unfolded, art and craftsmanship blossomed in parallel with magic. Masons inscribed runes in new-built walls, weaving safety and song into the very stone. Farmers invented new rituals to mark planting and harvest, calling on both weather and memory to bless the crops. Musicians, inspired by the melodies of marked singers and the echoes of ancient spells, created new harmonies that spread from village squares to deep mountain valleys. Word of Eldhaim's transformation traveled, at first by foot and rumor, then in the form of visiting scholars and traders who once would have thought the whole land cursed. The sick and hungry journeyed from far kingdoms, asking not for charity, but for the chance to learn, to rebuild, to be part of the slow, radiant healing. In the capital now, only a shadow of its former grandeur survivors began to peel back boarded windows and gather in silent, growing hope. Some sought out Emberwyn, bringing relics of the past for blessing or burial. Others carried old grievances with them, hoping for reckoning or amends. Each encounter, whether tense or jubilant, left the world a little better woven, a bit more whole. Perhaps most moving of all were the reunions, families reunited by fate, enemies quietly forgiving, strangers discovering kinship in the shared scars and dreams of survival. The plague was never forgotten. It lived in ritual, scar, and the knowledge that nothing could ever go unquestioned again. Yet for the first time in a generation, laughter began to sound above the city roofs. In the morning, children ran among fields where ghosts had walked, inventing games with magic and memory and the promise of a bright and tender tomorrow. As the autumn moon set over the lands of Eldheim, even the stars seemed closer drawn by the songs of a people who had not only endured the ending of an age, but who had learned through loss to be both gentle and wild in their creation of what would come next.